So you may have heard the news this week because media loves anything that can put gaming in a bad light, but the headlines read, "Playing shooter video games damages the brain, study suggests." And then, of course, everybody piled on because this is great clickbait, mate. But there's a few things that aren't being as promoted as this headline is. Like, for instance, how some people in the study actually saw benefits from playing shooters. So let's take a look at the study, what they looked at, and then we can kind of evaluate it. So the study looked at 100 people, 51 men, 46 women. The researchers used a virtual reality test, which was a maze that participants had to go through multiple times. Then they had 90 hours of game playing, and this involved people who were both expert and non-expert players as far as video games go. And then they used MRIs to assess the impact on the hippocampus, which is part of the brain that helps spatial and episodic memory. And if that part of the brain isn't working well, that can cause you a lot of problems down the road that you don't want. So they took two groups of people. You have spatial strategy players is what they called them, and these players find their way around a map, for instance, by looking at landmarks, by being aware of their surroundings. You can pretty much call them strategy players. They can create maps in their head to understand where they're at in a game. So they're not just, drones just shooting whatever pops up in front of them, and one of those corridor shooters. Like, these are people, like, for instance, on a open world map, knowing where they're at and strategizing and kind of going from there. And then they also looked at response players, which are the corridor shooters, the people who just react to things. And so they're not really paying attention to anything else other than, shooting people. And the way they measured these people is they put them in a virtual reality maze and made them go through the maze several times. Spatial strategy players would learn how to navigate the maze by recognizing different landmarks in the scenery. So, for instance, if a certain turn had a rock or a certain building or a different color and so forth, they would be able to navigate the route by looking at those different points on the screen. A response player paid no attention to that, and so they were just trying to memorize, hey, go left here, go right, go left, etc. So they compare it to how sometimes whenever you're driving a car and say you're driving the same route home every single day, sometimes you get home and you don't even remember most of the trip. And it's because your brain was sort of on autopilot. It wasn't thinking about the spatial awareness around you. It just knows all the turns, all the stops, and so forth. And so it's just kind of running things in the background without you really even having to pay attention to it. But say you're on vacation, for instance, or you're in a new area, well, you are looking at landmarks. You are trying to orientate yourself, and you do have that spatial awareness, which works your hippocampus. And so you have players who are working their hippocampus and players who don't. So they had these groups play 90 hours of shooters like Killzone and Medal of Honor, which, I mean, my God, if you sat me down and made me play 90 hours of Killzone or Medal of Honor, I'd probably walk away with brain damage too by the end of it. But regardless, they found that most people were response learners in these games, and response users aren't using their hippocampus, as we talked about before. So the gray matter shrunk in these people. But players who use spatial strategies, their hippocampus actually showed improvement. So even if you take this study as more than a grain of salt, it doesn't prove that shooters can cause brain damage. You got to look at the individual and how they actually use their brain. And I mean, you could then go look at a study from people who drive all the time down the same roads. Maybe they also could possibly come up with brain damage. So who knows? So the study does not say that shooters can cause brain damage. In fact, the study actually emphasized that this does not equal causation. But I will say, if you're an individual who just is a camper, you just sit behind a door waiting for somebody to walk through so you can shoot them in the back, I would like to say that we all hate you and that you might have brain damage. But video game expert Chris Ferguson, who is a professor of psychology at a university in Florida, does say to take this study with a whole lot of salt. He says researchers can sometimes make a big deal out of these random differences and ascribe them to something like video games. Ferguson notes that overall brain research, and there has been lots of it into the effects of games, hasn't revealed problems. Despite some wild headlines and press releases, the research suggests that video game playing is entirely safe for the brain. The aggregate of studies has not shown that playing video games, even violent ones, cause either short or long-term brain changes that are problematic or could possibly be called brain damage. Most studies, he goes on to say, also don't connect the brain difference to actual behavior. So brain studies often act like something more to tell you about what the researchers want to believe than anything actually happening in human behavior. So they look at this one thing, they have you play a bunch of games and try to draw a line to that point without looking at all these other aspects. He goes on to say that most research overwhelmingly supports that video games can reduce stress and improve problem-solving abilities. Playing video games, he says, should be balanced with other activities, offline socialization, exercise, work, school, family, and good sleep. And as long as games are part of a balanced lifestyle, there's no evidence that they're going to cause any harmful brain changes. And I mean, that last part, he's dead on. And that goes for everything in life. You gotta have balance. And, you know, you go out, you get sun from outdoors, it's healthy. You get too much sun, you get skin cancer. You know, playing shooters is fun and can be beneficial to your brain. Playing 90 hours of Killzone probably would kill anybody's brain cells. So that does it for me, The Red Dragon. You want to read more about it, links down in the description box. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.
Are you listening? Damn.